Great. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming today. Adrian Berry has just sent his apologies. He is a barrister and a case is overrunning, so unfortunately he can't make it. Just to say that Bright Blue is doing a big project. It's a year-long project looking to carve out a new balanced centre-right approach on immigration. It has various different components to it, but one of the components is this commission that we're running. We've already received several bits of evidence, written evidence, from organisations and experts, and those were submitted to us in August. And the second part of it is this oral evidence session, which will be filmed and will be on our website in a few weeks' time. Both the transcripts from this and the written evidence will be published in a final report towards the end of the year, which will be like a select committee report. And at the front of that there will be policy recommendations from Bright Blue. The commissioners here, who diverse range of people from different perspectives, won't necessarily endorse every policy position Bright Blue has, but they will be asking you some searching questions today. So how we're going to run this is I will ask you to introduce yourself and say a few introductory remarks about refugees and current government policy and what you'd like to see change, and then we'll open it up to questions from the commissioners. So if I could ask Jan to go first.
Hello, thank you for inviting me. My name is Jan Shaw and I'm the Refugee Programme Director from Amnesty International. I would just like to start by saying that there are no legal safe routes for refugees to come to Europe, with the exception of resettlement, and unfortunately the UK takes very few people, pitifully few people, either under its regular resettlement programme or under the Syrian programme that's been set up for the Vulnerable Persons Relocation Programme. This means that people who are fleeing persecution and conflict are making perilous journeys, which we read about every day. 2,500 people have already died in the Mediterranean in the first 9 months of this year. For those that do get to Europe, the UK takes about a quarter of the amount of asylum applicants than Germany, and half as many as France and Sweden. And
proportionate to our population, is that?
No, that's actual numbers. Actual numbers. In 2013, we took just over 23,500, and in 2013, and this year we're on target for about 25,500.
So we're talking about refugees or asylum seekers?
We're talking about asylum seekers, people who are applying for asylum who haven't yet been through a process. Of those people who do make it to the UK, current statistics show that about 35% do get refugee status after their initial decision. But each year statistics show that between 25 and 29% of people whose application for asylum is refused is overturned on appeal. And last year, Amnesty International and the Still Human, Still Here coalition carried out research into why that was happening. I think I'll stop there, and maybe you want to ask me questions about that.
Did you have a question now?
I had a question. I didn't know if you wanted to go.
Well,
so to speak. I mean, on this the specific Syria issue, am I right in thinking that so far we've only accepted around 50, 55?
It's gone up. It's now 75. I had that from the Home Office, a Home Office meeting with officials on Monday.
And are they in tune at all with public opinion, which would suggest that, in broad terms, the British public is okay with accepting more, so long as it is?
They seem to be. They're very, very focused on being the second biggest donor of aid at £600 million to the region, and very focused on keeping people in the region rather than allowing people to come to the UK. And I think they're planning on about 500 over the next 3 years, which is poor by comparison to other European countries. The States is taking an open number of people, and Germany's already pledged 20,000. So it's poor, and we've been really lobbying, and we will be lobbying over the next few months to try and make them take more, but I'm not optimistic.
What would you see as a fair amount?
I don't really want to place a figure on it, to be honest, but anything more than we're taking now would be a step in the right direction.
Okay. Thank you. So we'll move now to Dave.
Again, thank you for inviting. I'm Dave Garrett. I'm the Chief Executive of Refugee Action. I thought what I might do is just outline a few sort of perverse disincentives that seem to exist in our current asylum system to chew around. At the moment, and because Jan's given you the statistics, which are pretty clear, I think. I mean, some of the problems in the system which result in that high turnover rate, long length of asylum determination, it takes a long time to get an asylum decision, we have a legal aid system for asylum seekers that has a number of perverse market-based disincentives in it that basically, if you want to give high-quality legal advice, you can't. What you're incentivized to do is to give as little legal advice at the beginning of the process as possible and shunt the process off to appeal, which stops decisions being made right first time. There's an absolute fundamental lack of knowledge in the asylum system from asylum seekers themselves. So the people we see every day at our doors basically tell us mostly that they don't know what it is, what the system is they're applying for, how it works, and how they should properly engage in it, because over the last 10, 15 years there's just been a destruction in the amount of advice and support that asylum seekers get as they go through the process. Further, the problems are exacerbated by the fact that essentially asylum seekers aren't allowed to work. They're not allowed to support themselves. I mean, after a year you can apply for certain occupations, but you basically got a group of people who are being kept well below the poverty line and therefore struggling to do the things that they're supposed to do to engage in the asylum system and get the decision that they deserve. And right at the end of the process, you have a system where people are evicted from their accommodation with only 28 days notice, which further incentivises people to disappear, go into destitution, rather than at that stage, if people have a refusal, being able to think clearly about what to do next with their lives and make proper decisions about them. So again, you're incentivising people to do what you don't want them to do. And then finally, and I just echo what Jan has said, the figure of resettlement that the UK takes just doesn't recognise global circumstances. I mean, Syria is a case in point, but it was the case anyway. But there's 1.2 million Syrian refugees in the Lebanon. 1 in 3 people in the Lebanon is a Syrian refugee, and the UK so far has taken not even 100 people. The mainstream resettlement scheme takes 750 people a year from people in protracted refugee situations across the world, and this compares really unfavourably with numbers taken by Australia, US and Canada, and it just isn't a credible response to the global refugee crisis.
Can I ask what you think the cause or causes are of that lower number being taken by the UK?
It's ultimately a political decision, and I question severely whether a higher number would be noticed politically. I think a government could come in and say, let's stand up for our global responsibilities, let's take 5,000 people, let's take 10,000 people, and I question whether, I certainly don't think, and the Syrian example is a good case in point, presented well, I don't think that would be necessarily negatively received by the British public.
So when you say political, do you mean that just there's general scepticism of immigration generally and politicians are responding to that, or is it more of a strategic decision, which is, we think it's better to use aid rather than take in refugees?
I think most of asylum policy and refugee policy is been based on the politics of fear for 10 to 15 years, and there's been precious little, although there's a lot of rhetoric about politicians will say we have a proud tradition of working with refugees in this country. The practical reality of that has been actually quite merely mouths responses in terms of, yes, we will do a resettlement programme, but it will be 750 people.
I think asylum and refugee issues were obviously at the epicentre of the public politics of immigration, if we go back 15 years, as you're saying, and now not nearly so much at all. It's about EU unskilled economic migration. Just 2 questions about that. I mean, clearly, the number of applications was much more at the 100,000 level than at the 2025 level it's now at. People probably don't don't know that. But the system clearly was very, very, very bad at coping, big backlogs and so on. How much better or worse is that in terms of the new applicant? I mean, is in terms of the sort of timescales that people take and getting lost in the system, how fixed is that or not fixed? Because I think a group like this could certainly look at the technocratic ability to make better decisions well, get them right first time, and maybe have views about the backlog. And then on the settlement kind of issue, which is obviously slightly different route, feels to me that after that sort of storm, public opinion is we want to protect our tradition, we wouldn't tear up our commitment that we protect genuine refugees, probably what they'd say. And there's no political pressure or media pressure to not do something for people that we should do something with. But then there's a real worry about, are we being a soft touch in public opinion if we do our bit, or other people doing their bit too? So I was wondering what the scope is to use, say, the German example, to sort of, at a pan-European level, shouldn't we say, if every European Union member was to say a few hundred, and the larger ones 1,000 or more, you'd actually get a significant uptick in the number that the EU took. But that would be, I think, a very good signal to British public and political opinion that you were doing your bit and encouraging other people to do their bit. I mean, how resistant is the British government to sort of trying to coordinate a bit more at that level?
Yeah,
Start
you
with
start.
very big questions. Just to ask the second part first. The Swedish immigration minister went on record recently saying that the EU should do its bit on resettlement and take in 100,000 people. And if you actually divided that up amongst the countries, it doesn't come to that many people each. My personal opinion on the politics in this country is that it's about numbers. That if the government was seen to be bringing in more people, and I don't think people make a differentiation between immigration and asylum. If you lots of polls that are taken, people don't make a differentiation between people fleeing persecution and people coming here for other reasons. And I just, if you ask people about the number of asylum seekers that they think are in the UK, they will tell you something like 30% of the population. There have been, outrageous figures. So a lot of it is debunking myths, and it's actually very difficult to do that. I would support. You asked me about putting a number on people being resettled, but I would support a much more. I think there is a failure of asylum policy at the EU level. I think what we saw in Calais in the last few weeks, of a few thousand people in the port of Calais, it happens every few years. There's some problem because there's not proper housing, and people seem to want to come to the UK rather than apply for asylum in France. And about 10 years ago now, the British government did take some people when they closed the Sangat camp down. They took about 1,200 Iraqi Kurds at that time. The population there now are mainly Eritreans, Sudanese and Syrians. All countries where there are violations of human rights. And I think that the UK should look at some of those claims, because some of them will have links here.
Just to answer I think yes, there are a number of technocratic solutions to our current asylum system based on some of those market disincentives I've outlined. Not least, why not have asylum seekers being able to work, or indeed present it as an obligation to work, so that they can support themselves? That would seem to me to be something that would resonate with the British public's need not to have the burden on their taxes. In terms of the overall resettlement numbers, I think the fact that other nations take thousands more people through resettlement can and should be used to increase our own numbers, and I think it would have the added effect of, as Jan says, getting some of those myths out there about the burden that the UK takes, whereas in fact in comparative, that isn't the case at all. So I think that would be useful.
Dave, sorry, just one point of clarification on in your initial remarks, you talked about legal representation and problems around that. What specifically would you change there?
So at the moment, the flat fee you get for initial legal representation isn't enough, and everybody knows it isn't enough to provide proper and adequate legal representation for people's asylum claim. So the temptation for solicitors, and of course there are good and bad solicitors, and the good ones try very hard, but the temptation of solicitors is just to do as little as possible, knowing that things will get rectified on appeal. At appeal, if you want legal representation, your legal representative has to show that they have a 50% or better chance of winning that case. So you're already assuming that even someone with if you can make that judgment, but someone with a 49% chance of winning their case will in fact be have their legal aid refused. So you have a situation where basically as much as possible is shunted down the end of the asylum process. So you're spending more money on support and costly court proceedings, and then a situation where a good number of people who should have had an appeal because their initial case wasn't heard properly, because the legal aid wasn't enough, are then left not being able to appeal, and so that's why you get into this cyclical, more appeals and people putting fresh claims in rather than it being all sorted at the beginning. That you end up with higher legal aid fees, you end up with more repeat applications and fresh claims, and you end up with higher support fees as well, because don't forget asylum seekers aren't able to work, so the cost of them all falls on the taxpayer to support them while these lengthy processes are being sorted out.
Okay, David.
Yeah, I mean, don't we need to move with the times in the sense that we do indeed, I think, have a proud tradition of openness to the persecuted, 18th, 19th century, the kinder transport. But it's much harder to apply some of these rather eternal principles and rules in an era of mass transit. And you are suffering, in a sense, from the national scar of the 1990s that Sundar referred to, when there was a very strong feeling that the system was being abused by tens of thousands of people every year. And I would say, British people are now less open to asylum than they used to be. It's for those two reasons. I mean, it's on a scale that it never used to be in the 19th or the first part of the 20th century, and there is a question mark over much of it. So, let me suggest to you one thing that might help to deal with those anxieties, which is that the principle should be one of a safe haven for a limited period of time. The idea that it is open-ended, that somebody can come here from a country that's just exploded and stay here forever is part of the problem. I mean, all of these crises are calmed down at some point, and actually, people are needed to rebuild these countries. If someone comes here for 3 or 5 years and goes back, then I think the whole principle becomes much more acceptable to the British population.
I'd have to reject your premise, which is fine, but I'm not convinced that all of the focus group studies, public attitude stuff, the UK population is still very keen on giving sanctuary to people who have a well-founded fear of persecution. So I'm not sure that's true. And certainly if you look at the history of things like the Bosnia and Kosovo programs, where many thousands of refugees were brought over, they had widespread public support. So I'm not sure about your premise. Very practically...
But my premise was not saying... my premise... You're not contradicting my premise.
Your premise was that there's not public support for this.
Because there is a fear that there is so much of it is not legitimate. I mean, of course everybody thinks that legitimate refugees are fine. But the waters have been muddied by the mid and late 1990s. And I think that continues to be the case.
In terms of a solution of giving people temporary protection, all that would do was exacerbate a situation where people's lives are being left in limbo. So for the individuals themselves, that doesn't work. But for UK PLC, how does that work to leave someone 3, 4, 5 years not knowing whether they can permanently or not permanently settle in the UK? That doesn't seem to be of any benefit to anybody. What's a benefit is to give what, and people can and people do, but the idea that you would, but
do we have any figures on that?
The number of people that, well, I would say that every refugee I meet where it is stable always thinks about home, thinks about what it would be like to go home. What I am suggesting to you, though, is that the idea of keeping people in a permanent state of limbo has absolutely no benefit to the UK at all, because how can people properly settled, properly learn the language, take education and have a productive career where they start paying their taxes if at any moment they think they might be sent home in 3 or 4 years?
But refugee status, which is what people are given if they fulfil the criteria, is not permanent. It's only for 5 years, and then you have to make a further application to be able to remain here. And actually, as I said in my introduction, that on average, every year at the moment, about 35% of people are getting refugee status after their initial decision, after their application has been processed. And when you take into account the appeals that have refused asylum and then are overturned, that brings the total to well over 50%. And there are, and you look at where people are coming from. The top applications in 2013 were Iran, Sri Lanka, Syria, and Eritrea, all with gross violations of human rights as their current record. And I agree with Dave. You know, I've never met a refugee yet who doesn't, at some stage, want to go home. But if a conflict or a situation remains protracted, it's very difficult if you've been a certain number of years out of a country.
So can I just pick up on this point about 5 years? How long has that been the rule that you have to reapply
as long back
5 years?
as long back as I can.
Right.
Always, it's always been.
No, it was 2000 and something.
Yeah, I thought it was late government.
No, but that you used to get permanent residence immediately when you got your refugee status,
Yeah,
and it changed then. Then it changed.
Yeah.
And then you had to apply.
What do we know about the 5-year kind of reapplication? Do they basically just go through on the nod? I mean, do we know what percentage of people?
If there's been a change in the circumstances in a country, then people would be expected to go home. But on the whole, I mean, can you think of many countries where there has been a change in circumstances? And most people don't. And the Chileans, for example, lots and lots of Chileans went home when Chile became safe.
As indeed did many Kosovans.
And Bosnians.
Yeah. But all that does, even now, as I say,
the whole of former Yugoslavia is now safe.
All that does is leave people in uncertainty for 5 years, not being able to properly establish themselves anywhere and not being able to contribute to our society.
Well, 5 years is quite a long time.
Carlos, you wanted to come in?
Well, just 2 quick questions. I mean, one is
it is quite a long time, and therefore quite a long time to be limbo.
Jan was talking about Cali. So from your explanation, they get there, but they don't apply in France. They want to apply in the UK. So it'll be good to know why they want to apply here and what is different about the system. And if they're coming from Africa, they have to cross the EU. Why coming to the UK to make the application? And Dave, you mentioned the basically refugees not being able, asylum seekers not being able to work. Basically, what I would expect is that this will end up in them working illegally, basically without the proper authorization, and probably getting involved in criminal activity or things like that because they don't have any other choice. Have you seen an increase in those 2 things, in irregular work and illegal activities among asylum seekers since this law was changed?
Do you want me to start?
Yeah.
I don't have a lot of knowledge about the French asylum system, but I do know that you have to have an address to be able to apply for asylum in France. And by definition, those people who are living in the woods around Calais don't have an address. Many of them may have family here. They may have links with the UK. But if there's no way of processing that application there, it's very difficult. That's where I feel that there's such a failure of responsibility sharing in the European Union. You've got all 100,000 people coming across the Mediterranean and landing in Italy. You've got people coming, Syrians primarily coming from Turkey into Greece, and the reaction is to push them back to Turkey. That's not the way to treat people who are coming from the sort of conflict that Syrians are coming from. And of course the burden, which we haven't mentioned, of people, 3 million people, the UNHCR is now saying, are refugees from Syria. Where are they? They're mostly in the surrounding countries. As Dave said, 1 in 3 people in Lebanon is a Syrian refugee. Jordan has taken 1 million people. Turkey took 100,000 Syrian Kurds over the weekend. We're talking about tiny numbers here in comparison, and being a very wealthy country.
But surely that's the best place for them to be. It's actually as close as you can safely be to their former countries. With and with us, we should pick up the bill for it. We should support these surrounding countries and make sure that they don't suffer as a result of it. You know, you can build reasonably decent sort of temporary towns, as there are all around the world. We should pay for them, and then the people will be able to, they'll know. They won't, instead of coming to live in a completely alien country where they're probably not particularly welcome, they don't understand the language, they come from a very different culture. They will actually be able to stay in touch with the conditions in their own country. What's so terrible about that?
I think if you were Turkish, you might have quite a different view. Turkey's taken the equivalent. I had a statistic just this morning. The equivalent is that imagine a situation where the UK had taken 800,000 people. So you might have a very different view if you were Turkish about burden sharing and who should or shouldn't be looking after people just because you happen to be in close proximity to somewhere, and that's probably a good reason, a good part of the reason why they've put up borders now. So I don't question that these things are complicated in terms of what's the best thing to do if events unfold. But do you seriously think the Syrian situation is going to evolve to a place where in the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years people are going to be able to return in safety?
Can I ask a question about prioritisation in terms of protection, and how would Britain best uphold its will and responsibility to do its bit? Would your priority be around more use of resettlement routes over time and switching to doing that, and it's a more processed way? And is there a knock-on implication to the traditional sort of asylum route as well, or is there any trade-off between those two things, and how does it work?
It is a problem, and there are. You only have to look at Australia, where they take something like 8,000 people and resettle them, but anybody who arrives by boat spontaneously is automatically detained, and there shouldn't be a trade-off. There has to be a way of doing it where you do resettle a certain number of people, but you still allow spontaneous asylum seekers access to your refugee procedures.
I don't think you can have a trade-off because they're two different client groups. So most resettlement programs are geared around people in long-term protracted refugee camp situations where you've got people that have been in those camps for 5-10 years, and it's about having a sustainable solution for them. I think it's quite a dangerous ground to think, well, then you'd trade that off with, in any case, how would you legitimately say, oh, I'm so sorry, because we're doing resettlement, we're only going to take 5,000 spontaneous arrivals this year. By their very nature, they're spontaneous arrivals. Just to answer your point about France, England, etc., I mean, there's very little evidence actually that things like reception conditions, whether it's right to work or support payments, really have any difference at all to which European country people end up in. People end up in European countries, A, because of where their agent puts them, but B, because of historic linguistic and cultural ties. So most likely the people coming in Calais are people that have English as a first language, and that's the primary reason why they want to come to England, which is why France actually has, you said at the beginning, is nowhere near streets below or above us in terms of number of asylum applications, because there were people with French as a first language that will go there.
Kate?
Well, a lot of what I was going to ask about has actually now already been touched on, but to come back to David's point about having actually been to the Syrian border and done quite a bit of work on the situation for refugees, I would just add that the Turkish people think of themselves as very separate from Syrians, and of course they speak a different language. One of the problems with the refugee camps in the area is that the Turkish government are very keen to ensure that Syrian children are kept in schools learning Syrian Arabic rather than being taught Turkish, precisely because they want to keep them in this kind of limbo, which seems an added political pressure on an already unstable country. But to ask you a question, we've all talked about the politicians' fear of public opinion. You say that you don't think that the public is as opposed as politicians fear. What polling are you using, and how do you feel that the general public recognises the scale of the Syrian disaster, recognises this as a one-off or an exceptional issue? And is there any further evidence as to sort of whether they buy into all of the things that we're floating around the political sphere, like, oh well, we'll only take in Christians, or we'll only take in people from Damascus, or is that all completely above their heads?
I think in terms of polls of public opinion, I'd probably just point you over to Sundar, who would be able to give you a summary much better than we could, because he's the expert on that. I will say, on the ground, I mean, we're a charity and we raise funds on the back of supporting asylum seekers and refugees, and we have no problem doing so. You know, we do everything a charity does, and we send information out about our work supporting asylum seekers. And yes, we get some abuse for that, but we also get an awful lot of people donating us money. So we see tangibly on the ground that people are prepared to support it. And in terms of Syria, there was widespread public support for it. You know, in this sector, we all went out and talked to people and did media interviews, etc. And the groundswell of yes, this is a good thing was amazing, actually, and good to see. That's not a very sophisticated argument, I'm sorry, but I think, you know, I can only go back to what we know is that most people think that we should be given protection to people that have a well-founded fear of persecution. Now, the logical conclusion of that is that you have to have a system for judging that, and therefore you will have people that are rejected. But where you have a system where you know, around 50% of people going through it ultimately get protection, and that's a system that does have some flaws in it, as we started off saying, and so that and you know, people get back into it and churn back into it. There may be many more that should be getting protection that ultimately don't. That doesn't sound to me like a system that is being particularly abused.
And to be clear, you don't think Syrian refugees should be hoping to go home anytime soon?
I think Syrian refugees will be hoping to go anytime soon. What I'm saying is that the humane and practical response to it isn't actually to keep people in shanty towns and refugee camps. They do their best, but of course they're not the best environment to bring up your children in. And should the UK be doing its bit in terms of bringing people over here when Turkey has taken the equivalent of 800,000 people? Yes, I think it should.
And those who do just arrive and apply for asylum from Syria in the UK, 100% get refugee status. The only people who don't are people who the Home Office doesn't believe are Syrian, but everybody else does get refugee status. Can I just make an additional point to what you were saying about keeping people in the region and looking after them in decent conditions? Amnesty's just been on a mission to the Lebanon and to have a look at the conditions of how people are living. And one of the places they went to was the refugee camp of Shatila, which, as you know, has history, and it houses Palestinians. And it seems to me that, on the whole, there haven't been refugee camps in the Lebanon. People have been housed in poor quality rented accommodation, and now Palestinians are building rough structures on top of their own homes to house Syrian refugees. There are spontaneous refugee camps, unofficial ones, not run by UNHCR, popping up all over the place. So if only refugees were held in decent conditions, that might be a good argument, but on the whole, I don't think they are.
Can I just ask about the lists? There's a sort of country list, isn't there? Countries that are considered safe and countries that are considered, by implication, considered not safe. And does that change a lot, or did you have issues with that, or is it mainly reasonably sensible?
I don't think it changes a huge amount, and it's not only countries, it's categories of people within countries, and those people, the white list it's called, tend not to have rights of appeal in this country. Their applications are processed, and if they're refused, they're sent home, and they can appeal from abroad, or they end up in the detained fast track.
No. Correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't there? I mean, you do get controversies over countries. Wasn't Zimbabwe not on the list for a long time when a lot of people thought that it should have been? I mean, that it was people from Zimbabwe were not automatically considered for asylum. Even. I mean, it was, or perhaps I'm getting that confused.
I don't think Zimbabwe's been, and you get very, very few applications from Zimbabwe now. There was a peak a few years ago, but not now.
Just briefly, the other question is that one of the points one hears sometimes is that the grounds upon which one can apply for asylum have gradually been widened, mainly through case law over time. And the example that somebody mentioned the other day was that anybody who is gay and lives in a country where you're unable to be openly gay can apply for asylum, which, given how many countries in the world homosexuality is illegal, I mean, it's potentially a very large number of people. Do you think there are any issues to do with the the criteria for asylum and whether they've become too big and way too loose?
I think the primary problem with the determination system isn't whether the criteria are too big or too small. It's what I said at the beginning, which is that the system as it stands doesn't incentivise good first-time decisions based on the complexity of people's lives, because actually all those blanket things about are you gay or are you from this country, it's all to do with the individual circumstance that one has to look at to whether they have a well-founded fear of persecution, and it's that isn't being got at early enough in the system, and it's that which is the reason why people are rejected on first decision when they shouldn't be, and we're into this messy appeal situation. Ultimately, most of the determination problems could be sorted out by proper resourcing at the front
Let's
end.
go back to this sort of system improvement issue. I mean, you mentioned that there's very little voice of the experience of having been through it. How would you design, what sort of thing in terms of the people whose cases have been considered to be valid? What sorts of things could be used to make their experience, useful for systemic improvement?
Can I refer you to the research that we did last year? We decided to carry out research because, as I said in my opening remarks, that so many cases were overturned on appeal where people have been refused asylum. And we asked the Home Office to randomly select to our criteria 50 cases of nationalities where there was a high overturn on appeal. And we found that in 84% of the cases that we had selected, we had the refusal letter from the Home Office case owner, and the immigration judge's determination. In 84% of those cases, when the immigration judge looked at the application, they found that there had been a wrong negative credibility assessment of the applicant. And when we analysed the reasons why, it was because the case owner had been speculative or hadn't used all the available evidence or hadn't used the country of origin information, and they used a small number of inconsistencies to dismiss the claim. Furthermore, that if they thought they didn't believe one thing, then they went on to dismiss other things, creating a kind of domino effect. I don't believe this, therefore I don't believe this. And so, to answer your question, I think that they are about to set up credibility training in the Home Office, which we're supporting. They already get credibility training in their foundation course when they're first appointed and they start working as case owners. But the follow-up training for those who are a bit long in the tooth, been doing it a long time, is very important. Not to dismiss people because they don't have the same values as you have. You can't just dismiss people. There is guidance from the Home Office that some case owners just don't use. And so it's very important to make sure that if there are case owners who cannot be made to give a fair assessment of a claim, then they should be very strongly managed and dismissed from that kind of post.
What sort of people are these cases? I mean, who is it that is making this first decision?
The system's just changed. It was a higher level. They were higher executive officers and they all had to have degrees, and they've just downgraded the posts, which doesn't help because they had a huge amount of people leaving, and they've had to reintroduce and recruit many more people into the role. So they've lost a lot of skilled people, and they're just starting all over again.
Well, are they the sort of people that will have a presumption of scepticism, do we think?
No, but I'm talking more about not the new case owners, but people who've been doing the job for a while, or people who were presenting appeals for the Home Office, who, in the new scheme of things, found themselves as case owners and a bit sceptical.
Is there a significant resource issue about the amount of time you have as a person doing the determinations to make a decision?
It's not terribly clear how long people do get to make the decision, and there's a further problem now, whereas under the older system, which was called the new asylum model, you had one case owner who interviewed you, contacted your lawyer, and then made a decision on your case, and the system was supposed to allow for that person, if they refused, to present the case at appeal. That didn't really happen very much. Now, in the new system, you get one person doing the interview and a separate case owner making the decision, which is going to allow for a lot of mistakes, because you know, when you know yourself, when you talk to somebody, you pick up all kinds of things about them and their body language that you couldn't possibly make a decision on if you'd not met the person at all.
So sorry, just to pick up a point you said, they've lowered the entry requirements for the case officers.
I'm not sure if they've lowered the entry requirements, but the level of the calibre of person, the job
Right.
role has been
The grade is the
is
salary
lower
grade
grade.
is
It's lower.
Okay, the final question is, other than sort of increasing the numbers and improving decision making over cases of people seeking asylum, what else do you think would improve the lives of asylum seekers and refugees? What would you like to see? Perhaps kind of your top three.
My top three would be, we've already talked about legal aid and the perverse incentives in that, so sorting that out. Secondly,
So, but specifically on that, what would you? I mean, you say you're sorting out, but is there anything specific?
Higher legal aid first time round.
yeah, I think, or there's it wasn't that long ago that there was a regulated hourly rate rather than a flat fee,
Okay.
and getting rid of the incentive not to take appeals, which seems perverse. The forgotten people in all of this are always the asylum seekers themselves, and as I said at the beginning, too many of the people we see through our doors don't understand what it is they're applying for correctly. They don't understand the role of their solicitor, and they have expectations far and beyond what are actually real, and there has been a destruction of the advice that people get as they go through the asylum system, the non-legal representation that people get over the last 2-3 years, and that needs looking at, that needs enhancing, and the result of that will be that you will have people who are empowered to engage in that system and therefore do it properly rather than being disengaged in that system, and that would have benefits for everybody. And then thirdly, I'm going to think about my third thing while Jan talks, and then I'll
right.
come back to you on, I think, my
Everything
third
that
thing.
Dave said. Avoiding the use of detention, except in exceptional circumstances as outlined under international law. Access to advice and legal advice and legally aided advice and representation throughout the asylum system, and getting decisions right first time, which would save a huge amount of public money by avoiding unnecessary appeals.
So your view is the use of detention at the moment is not
It's excessive.
right.
And not necessary.
My third thing would be the excessive poverty that asylum seekers live in is A, wrong, and B, doesn't help them go through the asylum system properly. So either give asylum seekers the right to work, therefore to support themselves, or if it is insisted upon that people are kept on benefits, a little known fact is, of course, that asylum seekers are not eligible to mainstream benefits. They have a handout from the Home Office that if you're a single adult is around 50 to 55% of the value of mainstream benefits. So you're well below the poverty line. And too many of our clients tell us that they can't afford to feed themselves, feed their children, buy clothes, and all of that stops people engaging properly in what should be the most important process of their life, which is the asylum determination process. So my last ask would be, if not employment, a decent rate of support for asylum seekers.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you both for your time. Very interesting.
Thank you.